Millions of Americans say they're part Native American. And honestly, I don't blame them. It's one of the most powerful family stories you can inherit. Every family has that relative, the one who points at their cheekbones like, "See this face? Cherokee? No documents, no tribe name, just vibes." And for years, nobody questions it. Why would you? It sounds deep. It sounds historical. It sounds important. Then one day, you take a DNA test. You're excited. You're ready. You're already practicing how to say, "My ancestors walked these lands." The results load. And Native American ancestry is either 0% or so small it looks like a typo. Now you're staring at your screen like, so, was Grandma lying? Or was DNA just rude? Here's the funny part. DNA didn't expose your family. DNA exposed American storytelling culture. Because in America, we don't just pass down genes, we pass down legends. For generations, Native American ancestry became a way to explain things. Dark hair, high cheekbones, family mystery, or honestly, just being different. It was safer than saying, "We don't really know where we came from." And DNA doesn't care about vibes. It doesn't care about stories. It doesn't care about what sounds cool at Thanksgiving. DNA is like, here are the receipts. No background music. But here's where it gets mature and important. DNA doesn't erase culture. It doesn't decide my identity. It only tells you where specific genetic markers come from, not who you are or what stories mattered to your family. So when people say, "My DNA test erased my Native American ancestry," what they really mean is, it challenged a story I never questioned. And that moment, that discomfort, that's where real understanding begins. If this made you laugh, think, or side-eye your DNA results. Like this video, if you've ever heard a wild family ancestry story, drop it in the comments. I promise I'm reading. And if you enjoy content that mixes truth, humor, and real conversations, subscribe and share this with someone who swears they're 12% Cherokee. Millions of Americans genuinely believe they have Native American ancestry. It's not a niche claim. It's one of the most common family legends in the entire country. Think about it. Go to any family reunion and someone will inevitably say, "My great-great-grandmother was part Cherokee." Or, "There's some Sioux in my blood somewhere. I just feel it." And honestly, who can blame them? It sounds romantic. It sounds historic. It sounds impressive at Thanksgiving dinner. But here's the kicker. DNA tests almost always tell a different story. We're talking little to zero Native American markers. And yet, the belief persists. So here's the million-dollar question. If DNA doesn't confirm it, why do so many people believe it? The answer isn't simple. It's a mixture of history, identity, and a dash of storytelling genius. First, there's the American love for legends. We grow up in a culture that glorifies ancestry. Every family wants a story that makes them unique. And Native American ancestry, it's a badge of honor. It's exotic, it's mysterious. It's ancestral street cred. Then, there's selective memory. Families remember the stories that sound exciting and forget the ones that don't. Your great-grandma's Irish lineage? Meh. Your great-grandma's Native American lineage? Legendary. That's why some of these beliefs survive generations, even without DNA proof. And here's the mature, slightly uncomfortable truth. Belief in Native American ancestry is sometimes less about genetics and more about identity, pride, and cultural connection. It's not lying. It's storytelling. It's human nature to attach meaning to your roots. But DNA doesn't lie. It doesn't care about pride or sentiment. It just quietly reports, here's what your genes actually say. So this pattern we see, millions of believers versus almost no DNA evidence, isn't a joke. It's a fascinating reflection of American culture, history, and the stories we choose to carry forward. If this surprises you or makes you side-eye your own family tree, smash that like button, drop a comment about the wildest family story you've heard, and share this with someone who swears they're 12% Cherokee. Trust me, they need to hear this man. The infamous Cherokee princess story. Every American family has it. You know, the one, a great-grandma somewhere along the line was supposedly royalty, and everyone treats it like it's the most important historical fact since sliced bread was invented. My grandma was a Cherokee princess, someone whispers at the dinner table, like it's a secret passed down with solemnity and a ceremonial fork jab for emphasis. And somehow the entire family nods along, because, of course, that explains everything. The cheekbones, the dark hair, even the oddly specific love of cornbread. But why Cherokee? Why not Comanche, Hopi, or Iroquois? Cherokee is basically the default celebrity of American oral history. It's famous for being famous. Easy to remember, easy to repeat, and somehow sounds impressive enough to make any Thanksgiving conversation sound scholarly. Think of it as the vanilla ice cream of indigenous ancestry. Safe, familiar, but sprinkled with enough flair to impress your relatives. Here's where the story gets wild. Oral history is basically the telephone game of human culture. 100 years ago, your ancestor might have been just a hard-working woman doing laundry, cooking, maybe sneaking a cookie or two. Fast forward a generation or two, and suddenly she's a princess, maybe even a strategic negotiator of colonial politics, with an honorary palace somewhere in Georgia. It's not lying, it's storytelling evolution. History mutates like a dramatic Netflix show with special effects, costume changes, and a soundtrack you can't hear at the dinner table. Every retelling adds a little sparkle, a little drama, and maybe even a cornbread garnish. And nobody questions it. Cheekbones? Magical. Hair color? Evidence. Cooking habits? Proof of nobility. It's as if human behaviors carry royal credentials. By that logic, every cousin who makes exceptional mac and cheese is probably a duke. Here's the fun twist. What if the story wasn't lying at all? What if it was just misunderstood, exaggerated, or embroidered over the generations with love, pride, and a dash of imagination? That's the beauty of oral history. It's messy, human, and endlessly entertaining. It doesn't preserve genetics. It preserves identity, values, and a sense of wonder that spreadsheets, DNA tests, or Google searches could never touch. So next time someone casually drops, "My grandma was a Cherokee princess," lean in and appreciate the human masterpiece at work. Somewhere between myth, memory, and mashed potatoes, family stories become legends. And legends, my friend, are way more fun than reality. Now here's where the story quietly gets serious. Because sometimes claiming Native American ancestry wasn't just about romance or mystery. Sometimes it was about survival. Let's be honest for a second. History didn't treat everyone kindly. And for many families, the truth about their past wasn't something you proudly framed and passed down. It was something you softened, reshaped, or quietly replaced. For some families, saying "we're Native American" was easier than saying "we descend from enslaved people," or "we come from a history of violence, ownership, or erased names." That's not deception. That's protection. Think about it. For generations, racial stigma followed people everywhere. On paper, in neighborhoods and schools, even in job interviews. So stories evolved. The edges were rounded. Painful chapters were rewritten with something that felt older, nobler, and safer. And native ancestry, especially vague, undocumented native ancestry, became a kind of emotional shield. It explained darker skin without explanations people weren't ready to face. It explained missing records. It explained silence. Because here's the truth nobody says out loud. Identity is emotional long before it's scientific. DNA might tell you percentages, but it doesn't tell you what your ancestors were forced to survive. It doesn't explain why names disappeared. It doesn't show the fear behind silence. So when a DNA test suddenly replaces a familiar family story with something heavier, something tied to slavery, racial passing, or erased African or European roots, that's not just information. That's confrontation. That's history knocking on the door like, "Hey, we need to talk." And that's why some people react emotionally to DNA results. Not because science is wrong, but because the story they lived with was doing emotional labor science never had to. So when DNA reveals ancestry, it's not always uncovering facts. Sometimes it's uncovering things people weren't ready to face yet. That's why these conversations matter. Not to mock, not to strip identity, but to understand that family stories weren't created in a vacuum. They were created in history, pressure, fear, and love. And sometimes DNA doesn't just reveal ancestry. It reveals history people were still healing from. That's not funny anymore. That's human. Now, let's talk about what DNA tests actually do. Because some people think they're tiny time machines with feathers and drums built inside. Here's the truth. DNA tests don't ask your ancestors questions. They don't interview your grandma. They don't sit down with a tribal council and say, "So, what's the family tea?" What they do is much less dramatic, but way more honest. A DNA test basically says, "Let me compare your DNA to millions of people who have already tested." That's it. No visions, no prophecies, no spirit animals popping out of the results page. These companies have reference populations, groups of people whose DNA patterns are well documented. When your DNA matches those patterns, the test goes, this looks familiar. That's why Native American DNA is such a big deal in results. It's rare, specific, and genetically distinct. Not vibes, not cheekbones, not your aunt's confidence. Native American genetic markers didn't just spread everywhere like Wi-Fi. They stayed relatively contained because of history, geography, and, everything history did wrong. So when someone sees 0.8% indigenous Americas and immediately starts mentally designing a headdress, pause. Because a small percentage doesn't equal tribal identity. That tiny number could mean ancient shared ancestry, statistical noise, Manu, or a population overlap from hundreds or thousands of years ago. It does not mean, phone, you belong to a tribe. Phone, you inherit cultural authority. Or your family reunion needs a drum circle now. Think of DNA percentages like seasoning. A pinch of salt does not make you a salt shaker. And here's the part people don't expect. DNA doesn't measure stories. It measures patterns. It doesn't know who raised you. It doesn't know which songs your family sang. It doesn't know why certain stories mattered more than others. That's why DNA and family stories sometimes clash. One is math, the other is memory. And when the two disagree, it doesn't mean anyone was lying. It just means DNA is blunt. And humans are poetic. So yes, DNA tests are powerful. But they're not judges. They don't erase culture. They don't confirm their identity. They simply whisper, "Here's what the molecules say." And molecules have zero respect for dinner table legends. Now here's the part nobody warns you about. DNA tests are emotionally underqualified for the expectations we place on them. People don't open DNA results like they open bank statements. They open them like movie trailers. They're expecting epic music, a plot twist, maybe a dramatic voiceover saying, "Congratulations, you are the chosen descendant of something legendary." Instead, the screen loads, and it's just percentages. Expectation versus reality hits hard. In your mind, you were about to discover a hidden identity. In reality, you discovered that 62% of your DNA is aggressively ordinary. 30% is confusing, and the remaining 8% feels like it should mean more than it actually does. And that's where disappointment sneaks in. Because DNA answers biology, not belonging. It tells you where molecules traveled, not where you belong emotionally, culturally, or spiritually. It doesn't explain why certain music hits you in the chest. It doesn't explain why certain stories feel personal. It definitely doesn't explain why your grandma's kitchen feels like home. So when people say DNA tests are disappointing, what they really mean is, this didn't give me the identity upgrade I thought I ordered. Some people experience a full-blown identity buffering moment. They stare at the screen like, "Wait,
If this isn't who I thought I was,
then who am I?" That's not science failing. That's an expectation of mismanagement. Because humans want meaning. We want our ancestry to explain our quirks, our preferences, our destiny, maybe even our bad decisions. We want DNA to validate the version of ourselves we already believe in. But DNA doesn't hype you up. It doesn't roast you either. It just shrugs and says, "Here's the data. Do what you want with it." And that emotional gap, Between what people hope to find and what they actually found is where disappointment lives. Here's the truth wrapped in humor. DNA can tell you where your ancestors came from, but it cannot tell you who you are. It can't measure pride. It can't calculate belonging. It can't rank cultural connection. That's why people walk away feeling underwhelmed. Not because their ancestry is boring, but because identity isn't stored in chromosomes. It's stored in stories, environments, traditions, and lived experience. So if your DNA results felt anticlimactic, congratulations, you're human. You were looking for meaning, and science handed you math. And math has never been great at hugs. Now we arrive at the part where the video quietly leans back, folds its arms, and asks the question nobody escapes. What happens when DNA and your family story disagree? Because let's be real, most of us didn't grow up reading lab reports. We grew up hearing stories. Stories told on couches, in kitchens, during long car rides, and at family gatherings where facts were optional, but confidence was mandatory. Those stories didn't come with footnotes. They came with emotion, tone, timing, sometimes snacks. So when DNA shows up like actually, it feels less like information and more like betrayal. Now the big question lands. If DNA contradicts your family's story, which one do you believe? Because DNA speaks in percentages. It's calm, detached, a little socially awkward. It doesn't raise its voice or lower it for dramatic effect. It just exists. Family stories, on the other hand, have personality. They remember who struggled, who survived, who moved where and why. They explain silences. They soften pain. They give meaning to things science doesn't even attempt to touch. So choosing between them feels unfair, like asking whether you trust your birth certificate or your childhood memories. And then comes the second question, which is sneakier and far more dangerous. Is identity something you inherit or something you choose? Because if my identity is inherited, then DNA feels powerful, authoritative, final. But if identity is chosen, then DNA becomes informational, useful, but not in charge. And that realization makes people uncomfortable, because it means identity isn't locked inside chromosomes like a password-protected file. It's shaped by experience, culture, environment, and the stories that made you feel like you belonged somewhere in the first place. That's why these DNA conversations don't stay scientific for long. They turn emotional fast. They touch pride, memory, loss, sometimes even grief. Because changing a story feels like losing a version of yourself, even if that version was built on assumption. So maybe the real answer isn't choosing one over the other. Maybe DNA tells you where the road began, and family stories tell you how people survived the journey. One gives you coordinates, the other gives you meaning. And maybe identity lives somewhere in the tension between both, where facts exist, stories breathe, and humans do what they've always done best. Try to understand themselves without losing who they already are. All right, this is where we land the plane. Gently, but with just enough turbulence to make you think about your life choices. Because if there's one thing you've probably noticed by now, it's this. This channel is not here to tuck you in with comforting bedtime stories about ancestry. We're not here to whisper. Everything you heard growing up was 100% accurate and emotionally convenient. Nope. This channel exists in that slightly uncomfortable space where curiosity lives. The space where questions are allowed to ruin perfectly good assumptions. The space where DNA says one thing, family stories say another, and your brain just quietly goes, wow. Because uncomfortable truths don't destroy identity. They stretch it. They force us to think deeper than percentages, deeper than legends, deeper than what sounded good at the dinner table. And if you've made it this far in the video, congratulations. You are officially the type of person who doesn't panic when a question has no easy answer. You don't run when history gets messy. You don't need a neat label to feel secure. That's the kind of curiosity this channel is built for. So if you enjoy content that asks real questions about history, DNA, and identity, the kind that make you laugh, think, pause, and maybe text a family member like, "Hey, quick question," then yes, this is your moment. Go ahead and subscribe. Not because I asked nicely, but because your algorithm already knows you're into this kind of chaos. It's like if this video made you rethink a family story, or at least made you side-eye your DNA results a little harder than usual. And absolutely drop a comment. Have you heard this story in your family? The Cherokee princess? The mysterious great-grandparent? The we don't talk about that branch of the family tree legend? Share this video with that one relative who is very confident about their ancestry, but mysteriously allergic to DNA tests. You know exactly who I'm talking about. Because this channel isn't about comforting stories. It's about uncomfortable truths that make us think, and laughing just enough along the way to make the truth easier to face. Welcome to the conversation.